Can you make sustainable changes in community or neighborhood health without tackling the issue of food and diet? Why is such work so difficult? What is the role of churches and other faith organizations? Our next guest on the Leading Voices in Food is Reverend Darriel Harris, and he works on this problem in a variety of ways. I'm Sarah Zubek, Associate Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. Darielle Harris is on the cusp of earning his doctorate at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society. And he has a deep history of engagement with education. He holds a bachelor in electrical engineering from Morgan State, an MA in organizational management from George Washington University, a graduate certificate in financial management from U Maryland, and a master's degree of divinity at Duke University. And welcome back. So as you can see, he looks at issues from a broad range of perspectives, right now focused on faith-based health communications, neighborhood-related health factors, social determinants of health, and community-based participatory research. He previously worked as a health missionary in South Sudan and is also a pastor at a church in Baltimore, Maryland, and a member of the Black Church Food Security Network. Welcome, Dariel.
Thank you. Wow. That's a long list.
It was a long wind-up, yeah.
Right.
We had a lot to get through. You've got a rich background, which is why we're so excited to have you here today. So I wanted to start off, I just used a lot of terms that listeners might not be familiar with.
Right.
So could you describe what is meant by faith-based health communications or social determinants of health?
Okay, so those two things are very different.
Mm-hmm.
So faith-based health communication means that you're trying to do some type of health behavior change or some type of health education so people can become aware of an issue. And so you do that in a religious institution. So usually we call that faith-based. It's done good ways and bad ways. Usually when you just use the institution as a gathering place, sometimes we call that faith-placed. And then if you institute some aspect of the religion into the messaging, then we call that really faith-based because faith is playing a role and not just a node where people gather.
So I want to hone in on that before we get to the social determinants of health, because I feel like there's some great stuff right there. So you said some people do it well, some people do it not so well. Could you maybe give me an example from your work and then some stuff you've seen that you feel is not executed as well?
Sure. So I'm a critic. I'm a critic of the status quo, and essentially the status quo is that some scientists, well-meaning, some medical doctor or public health professional wants to convey some sort of health messaging to an audience, and so therefore they go to churches or to religious bodies because these are natural gathering spaces. But usually once they get there, the language that they use is usually scientific language, which is probably not most appropriate in that setting because within a religious setting, then there's a religious language that happens most often within those religious settings. The environment puts you in a certain mindset. That community has a language, and really when we start just honing in on language, and you can reference Wittgenstein or Paulo Freire. Anytime you do education that's meaningful, and Freire would say education that's not oppressive, it requires some type of dialogue, so people have to be on equal footing. And the way that science has engaged with faith-based institutions historically has been that they come to the faith-based institution and they speak science, they lead with science, and then they leave, and then they're expecting people within the faith organization to adjust and to embrace their messaging. So I'm a critic of that. I think that there has to be more of an equal footing. What I'm proposing is more or less like a dialogue where the faith institution and the scientific institution are equal partners on equal footing. And so instead of the scientists coming into the faith body and speaking scientific language, the scientist is going to the faith body and saying, faith body, teach me how to speak in your way. And then someone who's educated and trained and trained to articulate the faith language within that body is going to work with the scientists to come up with the proper messaging.
Great. So could you give maybe us an example of how you've been able to do that?
Yes.
What does that look like?
Okay. So I got this idea from, I was working with Ellen Davis from the Divinity School and Peter Morris. So they sent me to South Sudan when I graduated from Divinity School.
And these are Duke professors.
Well, Ellen Davis is an Old Testament. She's like the premier Old Testament scholar living today. So she's a Duke professor. Peter Morris is, Dr. Peter Morris used to be a student of Ellen Davis's. He was the leading health professional for Wake County, and now he runs a nonprofit in Raleigh. But they sent me, so Ellen Davis had been working in South Sudan for years. She invited Peter Morris to come join her. Peter Morris decided to do that, and they've been going to South Sudan year after year after year. I come along, and then they invited me to join them as well. And so I went along. But they pushed this agenda that said, go to South Sudan and try to teach people about health. And when I went to South Sudan, everyone wanted to hear about the Bible. They didn't care about health. I mean, not that they didn't care about it. They cared about it, but that wasn't what they were most interested in. And so I was there trying to teach them about health, and they wanted to hear about the Bible. And Ellen Davis, with her biblical interpretation kind of lens and mindset, she was really pushing for kind of like a merging of the two. And so I did that. And so I taught people about malaria and washing hands with soap through biblical messages. So if we apply that to the American context, and we're saying, okay, if I'm a scientist, the way it's done now, the worst scenario would be the scientist comes into the church and says, people need to eat more fruits and vegetables. If you eat more fruits and vegetables, you'll be healthier, which is a common message because every doctor says it to most patients every time they go in there. And so, so the scientist will say that. If the scientist is somewhat savvy and is trying to be sensitive to the religious audience that they're working with, maybe they'll give their science-based message and they'll quote, people who eat more fruits and vegetables have a tendency to live longer. They're less likely to get this disease and that disease. But then they'll marry that with a verse, and they'll say the body is a temple of God, or they'll sing a spiritual hymn at the end of it. But it's kind of tacked on. It's like an addendum, really. And so what I'm proposing is to say, if you want to go into that faith institution and you want to teach people about fruits and vegetables, then we open up Genesis and we talk about how when God created the world, God created vegetation, and when God created human beings, male and female, God creates them and tells them that fruits and vegetables are to be your meat, or they're to be the primary ingredient upon which you eat. And so, and then you can marry in some science, say, okay, people who do this live longer, they have healthier lives, but it's a theological basis for the behavior and not simply a scientific basis for the behavior.
And so has that, in your experience, been more successful, and also maybe riffing off your experience in South Sudan?
So that's the test, right? So my dissertation is to test the effectiveness of the various modes, of those three modes. That's my dissertation. Science only with some type of religious reference tapped onto it, which is the status quo, or what I am proposing, which is a true merging.
Got you. So results pending.
So results pending. But in South Sudan, I can say anecdotally, in South Sudan, I would go into villages and I would teach these messages to people about mosquito nets. And I would talk about how Mary wrapped little baby Jesus in swaddling cloth. And what was the reason that she did that? And it's protective. The reason that she did that is protective. And I would say, now, if Mary was in South Sudan where the mosquitoes were killing everyone, would she allow her child to be bitten by mosquitoes, or would she put some type of protective cover over the child? And people would say, they would say, oh, Mary would cover the child. Mary would cover the child. And so there, we would go and we teach these. We had 10 lessons like this, and we would go teach the lessons, and the people would say, we've never heard this before. Now I would go into the health clinic and I would see on the wall charts of mosquito vectors, and I mean, people are constantly talking about malaria and where malaria comes from. But when we taught it, they said, we've never heard this before. So anecdotally, and we did, we sent another student. After I was there for a year and a half, I came back. Another student went there for a few weeks, and he went around and counted the pit latrines. In some villages that were there, they had 0 pit latrines when I was there. By the time he came there was 100 pit latrines in some of these villages.
So just learning about the science was not enough to leverage behavior change.
It's not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough. And behavior change is really, really hard. It's a hard thing to get someone to change their behavior. Get them to change their opinion is hard, right? Which is why, we see that in the political sphere. But it's also in our day-to-day interactions. And so you need every bit of leverage you can get. The biggest thing that they'll do differently is that they'll listen. So when you present it as a faith argument, faith presentation, at the least they're open to it a little longer before they shut their minds off. So it's not a panacea in such that if I come and I preach this message, then everyone's going to follow exactly what I suggest, right? It doesn't quite work like that. But what we're trying to do, and what we learn in seminary, we talk about preaching being something that affects the hearing. And so that's what we're trying to do in speech in general. And so using the theology, using the biblical language, using something that somebody already cares about allows them to listen and consider it a little longer. And most likely, if you're using some type of biblical reference, then it's something that's going to come up again, even without effort.
Yeah, and I think we know food culture is a very strong pull that's been there for years, but this is another kind of cultural power that could come to be leveraged. So I'm curious, we also talked, I left this a little while ago, but social determinants of health. I want to come back to that and talk about just neighborhood-related health factors, social determinants of health. What are these terms and how does it fit into your work?
So social determinants of health means what things are happening around an individual or a group of individuals that leads them to exercise the behavior that they practice. In my Baltimore context, we have a thing called food deserts or healthy food prioritization areas, or the newest term is food apartheid. And the reason why that term has come to fore is because food availability largely falls along racial lines, and the environments where healthy food is not available, you can't expect people to make wise decisions around their food when the only thing that they see is bad food. It becomes normal. So when we talk about people eating better, the social determinant of health says what's available to them, what's the norm within that community, what are the barriers that they have to go through in order to even buy or eat healthy food if they wanted to.
Great. And how does your involvement with the Black Church Food Security Network address those things? I know that's one piece of a larger portfolio of your work, but I'd love to hear more about that network and what it's trying to do.
And so the network is trying to do several things. Baltimore has so many problems that it's really hard to specialize on any one. And so the network is trying to address the food problem. And we use Black churches because Black churches are in abundance everywhere where there's healthy food is lacking. Where healthy food is lacking, there's an abundance of Black churches. and so the goal is to work with the Black churches, partner with the Black churches, so that they can be vehicles of change, right? And so we partner with churches. We planted gardens in several churches around Baltimore City. We're having market days, so kind of like a farmer's market, but it's happening at the natural meeting times of the congregation. So we started off at Ark Church in Baltimore City. They had like a Wednesday Bible study, midday Bible study. So we started off selling fresh produce at that midday Bible study. And then now we moved on to Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, which is pastored by Reverend Dr. Brown, who's going to be here at this conference, right? He's a great friend, and he's kind of like the lead of the Black Church Food Security Network. So now we at his church on Sundays, there's like a farmers market that's set up after church. So people, they come to worship service like they always have, and then after worship service, the market is set up. And so those who desire, and everyone is encouraged to participate, but those who desire can come and purchase food that's available.
Yeah, so I know you've got a lot of different pieces of work. So what maybe solution or opportunity are you most excited about right now amidst your whole vast portfolio?
It's hard to say. I'm excited about, so we have a farm. It's called Strength to Love 2 Farm. And my church started the farm before I was ever involved in it. But now it's there, and we're trying to figure out how to make it, how to mature it and have it grow to its fullest potential. That farm is in the middle of the area. It's in the middle of the neighborhood called Sandtown. Sandtown is the neighborhood where Freddie Gray was from. And so it's
Can you remind our listeners about
Freddie Gray is the young man who died in police custody a few years ago, and in response to his death, there was what we like to call an uprising, where CVS was burned, and there was violence between police officers and high school children. National Guard was called in. Children were called thugs by the mayor, by the president. It was a good time in the city because people were awakening to the issues, but it was a very rough time in the city because there was a lot of destruction. Things happened not the way that we wanted them to happen, and the city was characterized in the way that was not honest. Yeah.
And that is the groundwork for this place-based intervention.
Yes.
Food. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. So you're asking about what makes me excited. And so the farm is right in the middle of that neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's 1.5 acres. We're growing food there, and so we're growing food. We're employing returning citizens returning home from incarceration. We're selling a large amount of that produce is going to farms and high-end farmers markets because we're trying to create employment. But then a portion of that food is also going within the neighborhood. So we're solving problems. And we sell a portion of that food through, we partner with Black Church Food Security Network, and we sell some of that food at the farmers market that are on Sundays. And it becomes also an educational space. So people from all over the city come into one of the areas of the city that, frankly, is despised. It's a despised area by many people. Most people are afraid to come in there. They don't want anything to do with it. But people come to learn about the farm and to see the farm and to witness it. And so it gives everyone who works there a sense of pride, which is great. Which is one of our huge issues that they're kind of lacking dignity, and so any type of positive attention helps build that back up.
There's a lot of layers to that project. The dignity, the inclusive economic growth, the food security elements, education. I can see why you're excited about that one.
It's a lot of layers. And so if you wanted to talk about like what social determinant is most impacting why we have some of these food issues, and I would say it's the clustering of poverty. And so whenever we're envisioning putting low-income housing or federal housing someplace, usually we envision putting it in a place that is already highly stressed, which doesn't make any sense, right? Like these neighborhoods, so Heber like to say, oh, it's a food desert, but it's not just a food desert, it's an employment desert, it's all these other things. It's a life desert. And so people in some of these neighborhoods are dying 20 years younger than the affluent neighborhoods. And within the same city, we're talking like 2 miles away, people are living, there's a 20-year life expectancy difference. So why did that neighborhood get that way? Why did they put all the people who are enduring the most stress in life all in one place? So if we in all these different programs, even the farm is not enough to overcome all the issues that are associated with it. And so I believe the real issue is to disperse poverty.
Well, Darriel, Baltimore is lucky to have you. Johns Hopkins is lucky to have you. We're lucky to have you down here at Duke today for our event tomorrow and for this podcast. Thank you so much for spending the time today and sharing your expertise and wisdom. We really appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Once again, our guest today is Reverend Darriel Harris, doctoral student at Johns Hopkins and pastor at the Newborn Community of Faith Church in Baltimore, Maryland. So thank you again to our listeners. Please subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food at soundcloud.com or by visiting our Duke World Food Policy Center website. This is Sarah Zubek.